Welcome back to Insight as we examine the chaos in Libya that followed the end of the Gaddafi regime in 2011. Among Libya's many problems is an epidemic of kidnappings, hundreds of people going missing. They're taken by armed gangs, militias and militant groups for ransom, revenge, politics or simply power. Joining us on Skype from Geneva is Hanan Salah, who's the senior Libya researcher for the research and advocacy organisation Human Rights Watch. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, Hanan. I looked at the figures for 2014 to 15, about 600 kidnaps recorded then. Presumably, it's either getting worse or staying consistent.
I mean, I would say that these figures are even conservative. You must imagine that most of the kidnapping cases do go unrecorded. So whatever gets recorded are the figures that, where families actually end up filing a complaint at a police station or at the office of the general prosecutor. So to my knowledge, the figure is probably a multitude of that. And this really shows you the level of chaos currently in Libya.
And in one of your reports, I read that a woman told you that there was no point in going to the police because the militia were more powerful. You mentioned the general prosecutor. How strong is the prosecution system in Libya at the moment?
Well, I mean, often, to be honest, often the police is the militia. So if you're extremely unlucky, then the police station in your area, in the area where the crime happened, will even refuse to record the case because they're afraid for repercussions on their own side. So yes, I mean, I fully concur. The lack of a strong central authority in Tripoli, particularly where we've seen this epidemic of kidnapping, as you've called it, is creating all of these issues. With regards to the judiciary, that's another big problem with the political fragmentation and the fragmentation of the central authority and the police force. It also means that the judiciary has collapsed in most parts of the country. In Tripoli, it's really barely functional. Some court cases for, let's say, family cases are ongoing, but for anything that's deemed slightly more sensitive, prosecutors are really unable to prosecute and, let's say, summon militia members or summon anybody that's accused of kidnapping. So it's a very, very twisted and very difficult situation.
On the last journey that you made to Libya to make your reports for Human Rights Watch, how struck were you by the changes? What sort of impact did the lives of ordinary Libyans make on you when you visited the country?
So I've spent a lot of time in Libya. I even resided there for many years before having to leave a couple of years ago when this conflict broke out. I think that this time what struck me, going back to Tripoli, a city that I love and that I've spent a lot of time in, is that it's currently reminds me of a patchwork of militia turfs. Where it's very noticeable once you move between the different turfs. People live about their lives. They go about their daily lives. They do whatever they can do. They send their kids to school on days where there's no clashes in their areas. They queue for hours at banks in order to be able to get out what's the equivalent of 30 to 40 US dollars. They queue at gas stations. They suffer a breakdown in every utility that you can imagine. The health system has broken down. So the situation for the ordinary Libyans, especially in Tripoli, has become really very difficult, and it's also very noticeable. What's another thing that I have noticed is that everybody that I spoke with has at least one story of a relative or a friend who's been kidnapped. Now, most of them have been kidnapped for ransom or for extortion, but really everybody has a story of either being threatened to be kidnapped or know of a concrete case of a kidnapping. It's become a really very, very widespread form of income generation at some level.
And we know that militia start this round of kidnapping. We've seen it in cities like Baghdad. We've seen it in Beirut going back to the 80s as well, as a way of raising funds for their organization. But it's also a means of political control, isn't it? And there are a number of cases where people of political significance have disappeared and there's been no ransom. There's been no claim of a kidnapping. Can we assume, therefore, that some of these people are simply being taken away and assassinated?
everything can be assumed at this point in time, and people still do get assassinated. So apart from the abductions and the enforced disappearances, such as the case of two activists now, one of them a Sudanese national, Jaber Zain, and the other one a Libyan national, Abdel Muaz Banoun, who went missing 2 years ago, over 2 years ago. So, you know, some of these kidnappings do have a political significance. Some of these kidnappings are meant really to silence critics and to ensure that there's no voices of dissent against whoever's in charge at that particular time. And this is something that you know, we have seen has become very, very widespread. You know, that being said, still, the bulk of kidnappings is for ransom. The bulk of kidnappings, such as the 200 or so cases or 300 cases that were recorded just in the past few months alone, I would say the bulk of those has a financial undertone and a financial reason. And I don't want to minimize the political side of it. And we've seen enforced disappearances and abductions take place all over the country. I think it's become quite flagrant in Tripoli because of the sheer numbers. But there's also people that remain missing or that get kidnapped for weeks on ends. For example, the mayor of Sirte, who was kidnapped, I believe, for 6 weeks without there being a ransom claim for political reasons.
And it's poisonous, isn't it? This kind of activity becomes the norm. There is no law to control it, so it almost becomes the law in itself. Is it frustrating for you that Libya often falls away from global attention? It has its moments from time to time where people are concerned, particularly I'm thinking of the US Embassy attacks in Benghazi, or even going back as far as the Pan Am bombing back in the 70s. But is it frustrating for you that people don't pay as much attention to the fate of Libya as they do, say, to Syria or to Iraq?
Very. Libya has really fallen off the map. Probably there's two issues: the issue of ISIS in Libya, also the issue of migrants and asylum seekers that do grab some media attention. However, you know, the other issues go totally unreported, such as the issue of kidnappings and abductions, which you're highlighting today. But there's also an issue of long-term and mass arbitrary detention in Libya, where thousands of people, I would say anything between 6,000 to 8,000 people, are held in long-term arbitrary detention for years without being charged. That's an issue, for example, that is, you know, not being highlighted at all. It's really a very vicious cycle for Libya. There's currently 3 governments that are vying for legitimacy. Only one of these governments is recognized by the international community. There's a fragmentation of the security forces, and you know, most of these alliances are shifting alliances and are very tenuous. So it's very, very difficult, you know, for the ordinary citizen to go about their daily lives, to send their children to school, to know that when they get home, there will be power after a long day of fasting, such as now in Ramadan, that they know that they will be able to cook dinner and break the fast together. So it's a very, really, it's affecting the local population to an incredible extent.
And Hanan, we're running out of time, but very briefly, these families that try and go about their business and try and keep some sort of normality in their lives, of course they'll struggle in the way you've described. Is there also a situation where those who can leave Libya, professionals perhaps, civil servants, teachers, doctors who have family elsewhere, are leaving the country and therefore leaving those that can't leave without that sort of support structure?
I would say that there's been a major brain drain out of Libya. Most of the journalists, human rights defenders, many professionals that came back after 2011, when they saw the light, they thought that things had changed, are now leaving. Again, many people of my acquaintance, especially human rights defenders, activists, and journalists, have left the country because they're no longer able either to sustain themselves or it's become too risky and too dangerous for them to stay. I would say that this is something that will, you know, become even a bigger problem unless the situation gets somewhat under control.
Hanan Salah from Human Rights Watch in Geneva, thanks very much indeed for joining us today on Insight. Well, that's all for now. I'm Andrew Wilson, and that was Insight.